Oh, really?
Yeah, he's retired. No, he's born. He worked TSS.
He's David's
Hi, good evening, folks. My name is Dave Lamb. I'm the organizer of tonight's presentation. I'd like to welcome you all. It's fortunate it's a nice night. You guys are able to come out. So I just wanted a few announcements before we get started here. Next month, on Thursday, the 19th of March, we have, let's see here, the Lost Car Companies of Detroit. It's going to be held here at 7 p.m. right here at the Woods Branch. And hopefully you can make it out because we will discuss the history of the Detroit Motor City and all the companies that existed back then. And then on April the 23rd, Thursday at 7 p.m., it's going to be moved over to the Central Branch because we have a board meeting being held here, so hopefully you can come on out to our program Dogfight Over Tokyo. That is going to be by John Wukowitz, talking about the last dogfight of World War II, just as the armistice in the Pacific went into effect. So hopefully we can get you come out for that. And we'll be wrapping up for this season. The final lecture will be on Thursday, May 14th, back over here at 7 p.m. at the Woods Branch, in which Karen Risko will be talking about a History Lover's Guide to Detroit, a tour of the city that puts the world on wheels and discover an amazing history of innovation, philanthropy, social justice, and culture. And you'll get to walk through the Motown, tour Art Deco masterpieces, walking in the footsteps of people like Martin Luther King to Cobo Hall, where he first delivered his I Have a Dream speech. So hopefully I can get some of you to come up for that as well. And let me introduce you to tonight's speaker. Author is Denise Hurd. She is a retired technical writer who for many years developed training videos and manuals for technicians in paper mills, power plants, and manufacturing. Compelled by an unexpected visit from a stranger, she applied her storytelling talents to this true story of her father to honor his memory and to share with those who may be touched and changed by his experiences. She will be joined by historian Mark Bando. Mark was a patrol officer on the Detroit Police Force for 25 years. He has written 6 books documenting the World War II experiences of the 101st, including Vanguard of the Crusade and the 101st Airborne Division World War II, along with 2 other World War II titles. He's an honorary member of several current 101st regiments and has been embedded with the 101st in Afghanistan. He conducts World War II battlefield tours and has had the privilege of visiting sites with veterans and their children. He's a frequent lecturer and will commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day with a parachute jump from C-47. We must have already done that. To learn more about Mark's books, visit his Trigger Time website at www.101airbornenew, that's 2 W's at the end, 2.com. And we're also joined by Candy Oro and Al Akers, who were the publishers, or I'm sorry, the web marketers for this as well. And hopefully they can wave their hands here to everybody if anybody wants to see who they are.
They
There
did
they are.
like the page layouts. Yeah.
So, and with that, let me introduce you to Denise.
Okay, how's that? Sound good? Okay. Thanks for coming out on such a cold night. I thought I'd get started tonight by just telling you briefly how I ended up writing this story about my dad's experiences. It was in 2017, just minding our own business at home, and the doorbell rings, and we look out, and there's a man outside, and he has a book under his arm. What's he selling, we don't know, but mysteriously, he says he's looking for me, Denise Hurd, and even more mysteriously that my dad sent him, and my dad died in 2009. Well, it turns out that Mark Bando is the historian for the 101st Airborne, and in 1968, at Wayne State, he was working on his master's, and he was interviewing all kinds of veterans in the Detroit area, one of which was my dad. And my dad asked him, after I'm dead, would you please go and find my daughter and tell her what really happened to me in the war? I interviewed my dad in 2004 about his experiences, but there were a lot of stories that he couldn't tell me. And like a lot of veterans, he never really told his combat stories to anyone. And so the stories that Mark shared with me were actually things he learned from the people that served with him through the other interviews that Mark was doing. And I don't think when I was young, people talked about post-traumatic stress, but I know my dad was troubled by his war experiences. He threw away his souvenir Luger. He threw away all his medals. He threw away his uniform. He threw away all the letters home that his mom had saved and that Mark had organized so thoroughly. But luckily, my dad saved some photos, and Mark had some photos and some letters home, and we're going to share some highlights of that with you tonight.
I was at the last time. I can't smell.
Thank you. This is the cover of the book. The book itself is done in a graphic novel format, which is kind of like a glorified comic book with some scrapbook thrown in. The artist for this is Kim Fujiwara, and he's a fine artist that lives in Rochester. The layout, as David mentioned, is done by Candy and Al at CO and Company, which is a graphics firm located in Farmington Hills. This is a picture of my dad towards the end of the war. He's on furlough here in Paris. I think this is at the Eiffel Tower. You can see that he was a section scout, meaning his job after he jumped out of the plane was to get behind enemy lines, figure out what they were doing, and then report back. My father was born in Illinois in 1922 and moved to Detroit in the 30s. He had a birth defect, pectus excavatum, which is Latin for hollow chest. It's an abnormal growth of the chest wall, which, like in my dad's case, it can push your heart and your circulation system out of position. I'll get this right by the time we're done. So things didn't go smoothly in the early years. His pectus was misunderstood. There was a brush with the law. At 16, he spent 6 months on the road as a runaway, and he ended up in Boys Town, Nebraska. In 1941, he graduated from Cooley High School, found factory work, and not surprisingly, was drafted in December of 1942. He volunteered for the paratroop infantry, thinking, well, double pay has to be good. He went through basic training at Camp Toccoa, jump school at Fort Benning, and maneuvers at Camp McCall. This is a letter home from jump school in Fort Benning after his first jump. Dear family, first jump completed, what a thrill. If there's anything in this world more exciting than a parachute jump, I don't want to see it. I began to get a little nervous when we started to walk toward the plane. The motors were roaring and the prop blast almost knocks you over as you mount the little stairs on the plane. Once inside, we try to sing and make merry to ease the strain, but it doesn't work any too well. Before long, the jump master gets up and yells, stand up, hook up, check equipment. And after this, he yells, stand at the doors. This is the signal for the first man and officer to take his position. After this is set, he looks back at us and says, is everybody happy? And we all commit a lie and say yes. Well, then let's go, he shouts, and out we tumble. And if you survive that 5 times, you get your jump wings. In December, the soldiers were given a furlough to go home and see their families because they were going overseas soon. My dad was engaged at the time. In January of 1944, the 2nd Battalion sailed across the Atlantic aboard this transport ship, the George W. Goethals. Having trouble with it. Letter home. Dear family, my sea voyage is almost over. Man, the waves on this man's ocean are something to see. Huge rolling mountains of water. We enlisted men are packed like sardines in the hold of the ship. Good place to store cargo if the cargo isn't too fragile. To kill time, I'm forced to read 10-year-old National Geographic magazines, which is just about rock bottom in the sphere of human activities. They landed in Glasgow, Scotland, and went on to Newbury, England, to continue training for Operation Overlord and D-Day. This is a map which many of you are probably familiar with, just sort of showing an overview of Operation Overlord. And you can see where the airborne troops are coming in via land rather than sea. And my dad's particular battalion are trying to get to drop zone D that you see in the map. But there were a lot of low prows and a lot of anti-aircraft fire. So the planes were forced out of formation and people ended up pretty scattered. Some of my dad's memories of D-Day. These are from the interview I did in 2004. We were shipped from Newbury to the coast, and then close to midnight we were rounded up and got into the planes. I saw pictures later that Eisenhower was there. I didn't see him myself, but they said when our planes lifted off, he had tears in his eyes. I think the assumption was we were going to be dropped right on the Germans, so the casualty rate would be very high, and I'm sure Eisenhower knew this. Just proceeding getting into the planes, some of us fellows blackened our faces. In the plane, we were very serious, non-commentary. As we got across the channel, you could see flickers of light coming toward us. anti-aircraft fire, which was kind of scary to see, that light coming up from the ground trying to down our plane. So off we went, and I landed. I heard a commotion, and it turned out to be a cow. I didn't see anyone after that, after I landed and I assembled all my equipment. As dawn broke, a few of us got together, still not our complete company. My first observations walking along the road, besides seeing a lot of cattle killed, were we saw young Germans our age killed by aircraft fire before they could get off the road into the ditch. So we see them in the expressions on their faces and the contortions of their legs, the shock of seeing their faces. We were about exactly the same age, between 20 and 22, and I had never seen a young fellow dead, let alone with that expression on his face. So that was a particularly vivid memory. The 2nd Battalion assembled and continued moving toward their D-Day objectives, all the while facing heavy German resistance. They were slowed down because the countryside was crisscrossed with hedgerows like these. At one point, they were pinned down by fierce enemy fire coming through a hedgerow, a complete stalemate. In the story told to Mark by Lieutenant Bill Sefton of the 2nd Battalion, all of a sudden, we couldn't believe it. There was Hurd walking right behind the line of Germans at close range. They couldn't hear him. He was just walking along the line and shooting them in the back of the head, one by one. He had tears streaming down his face. The 501st pressed on and surrounded Carrington. The 1st and 2nd Battalions brought up the rear, fending off some fierce counterattacks. And my dad is wounded, and Mark is going to share some of the details of that battle with us.
Okay, I started interviewing 101st World War II veterans in 1970, actually, 69. And now, after half a century of talking to them, I interviewed a total of almost 1,040 of them. And that's not mentioning all the ones I just casually met at reunions and didn't comprehensively interrogate them. But way back early in my research, I met a man named Leo Gillis, who was a lifelong Detroiter. And he knew Hurd because they were both in the same battalion, different companies. But on June 12, 1944, the 501st bypassed Carrington to the southeast, went up a rise that was 30 meters above sea level called Hill 30, and they turned left and went south and came out to a little hamlet called La Billenerie. It's just a complex of farm buildings. It's not really even a town. It's like half a dozen farm buildings that belong to the same farm. And at that time, there were a lot of people living there because they had about 200 refugees that had fled the fighting near Utah Beach, and they were moving away, trying to get away from the fighting. But on this particular day, there was a big battle about 300 yards away from this farm where they were staying. So I got interested in Gillis's company, and I decided to write a company history just about them, and I interviewed about 85 guys that were in that one company. And because my name isn't Stephen Ambrose, nobody would publish it. They said a company history is too narrow in scope. Nobody would buy such a book except veterans of the company or their family members. And then we saw Band of Brothers, which was about a different company in the same division. But you know, when you're Stephen Ambrose, things happen. So anyways, I talked to people from F Company 501 who were all along this hedgerow. See, they came this way from Hill 30 on June 12th in the afternoon, and then the 1st platoon went this way. They were here, and then the 2nd platoon was next to them. The 3rd platoon spread out along this shorter hedgerow. And there was a battalion from the 37th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment from the 17th SS Division, Guts from Berlichingen, and they were staging down here to counterattack Carentan and retake the town, they hoped. So the 7th Company of the 37th SS Panzer Grenadiers came up this way in columns. There was a column here and a column here, and they were coming up single file, one behind the other. And they had no cover, they weren't taking any precautions. And over on this end, they were waving white handkerchiefs, actually, trying to give the impression they wanted to surrender, which was just a ruse. So a man named John Penta from Palmyra, New York, showed himself here, came out to accept their surrender, and they still had their guns in their hands, so they threw their guns down and shot him dead right here. And before that happened, Stanley Green from Washington State, he was the oldest guy in the company. I think he was in his early 30s. And he had killed 30 Germans in one day on June 8th with his machine gun. Their St. Commandement. So he had his machine gun set up in his cap in the hedgerow, and Gillis was above him with his M1, and they were talking to each other, and they saw these Germans coming. And they had a guy named Walter Malton with them from Chicago, and he was also about 30 years old. And he had been born in Essen, Germany, and could speak fluent German. And he had a booming voice, so Gillis said, Malton, yell at these guys and tell them to drop their weapons and come in and surrender. So Malton yelled at them in German, and there's no doubt they heard him, but they never missed a step. They just kept marching straight towards this gap in the hedgerow. So Green was a very cool customer in combat, and he looked up at Gillis and he said, anytime you're ready, Gillis, anytime, just let me know when you're ready. And Gillis said, all right, when I open fire, you start shooting. So Gillis let him walk up horribly close. They were only about 15 yards away. He took a dead bead on the chest of the first German, fired his M1, which had armor-piercing bullets in it. And when he fired, the first 3 Germans went down, because the bullet went through the first man and the second man into the third man. Wow. And at that point, they started rushing forward, the other Germans, and Green started chopping them up with his light machine gun. So the Germans started fanning out, and some of them got right on the face of the hedgerow here. And meanwhile, the second platoon and the first platoon were engaging. There was a barn with an orange slate roof over here. The Germans were standing on the roof in plain view, smoking cigarettes, hoping to draw fire from the first platoon here so they could see where their positions were. So anyways, firing erupted all along this line. And during this battle, which went on for about 30 to 45 minutes, Denise's dad was over here on the highway with 2nd Battalion, and he worked his way along this hedgerow because he knew there was a lot of shooting going on over here. And he jumped across the opening, and he recognized Gillis, so he stopped to talk to him. And he said, there's a lot of Germans out there, what are we going to do? And Gillis said, yeah, there's a hell of a lot of Germans. I don't know what we're going to do because they're trying to turn our left flank over here. You understand, these guys were facing this way, south. And the Germans were attacking north. Well, anyways, as they were talking, Gillis was going up and down on the hedge bank, shooting from different places. And at one point, there was an explosion in front of the hedgerow. Hurd was hit in the chest, and he flew off the embankment down on the ground. And Gillis tore open some sulfa powder, cut his clothing away, and sprinkled some sulfa on the wound. And the shooting got so bad that all the leaves were being shredded off the top of the hedgerow. The Germans were massing all their automatic weapons and trying to build fire superiority. So Gillis said, I'm going to go down and find out what's happening at the other end. So the company commander was here, Captain Sammy Holman from Alabama. And he was right next to Lieutenant Ayler, who was the leader of the 2nd platoon. And Ayler had been shot in the throat because the Germans coming up here were waving white handkerchiefs too. And Captain Holman said, hold your fire, they want to surrender. So when Lieutenant Ehlert looked over the hedgerow, a German shot him right in his throat with an MP-40, and he fell in a sitting position, and then when Gillis ran up there, he tilted over sideways and he was dead. And Holman was sitting there on the ground with his arms around his knees, and he was stunned and he didn't know what to do. And he had a forward observer from the 907th Artillery with him, and he was too scared to talk on the radio because there was really heavy fire coming in. So Gillis grabbed Holman and he said, "We gotta pull out of here, go back to the center hedgerow and fall back a few hundred yards because they're turning the flanks, there's just too damn many. We don't have enough bullets to shoot all of them." So Holman said, yeah, tell him to start moving back. And he didn't look like he was gonna move at all, so Gillis grabbed him and he said, "Come on, let's get going." So finally, everybody over here got the word to move to the center, and they came along this hedgerow and went back. Gillis came back to where Hurd was, and he said, "Hurd, I gotta leave you here. We're pulling back, but we'll be back up in here, and I think the chaplain's around. He can look out for you, make sure the Germans don't shoot you." And Hurd grabbed hold of him and he said, "Don't surrender to the Germans, don't surrender, you know." So Gillis left him and they all went back along this hedgerow. Meanwhile, Joe Bassett got shot in the head over here. He was the best combat man in the company, and he delighted in battles like this. He'd run back and forth and shoot from different places in the hedgerow. But he got hit in the head. It wasn't fatal, and he was knocked out. And Schaefer and Tice dragged him all the way back to an aid station at Carentan. And the story was that he regained consciousness on the operating table, and he jumped off the table and said, "Where are the bastards? Let me at them." And he went storming out of the aid station. They had to run after him and tackle him and drag him back in there. And he ended up going through the whole war, and he went to the 27th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Division in the Korean War, the Wolfhounds, and they did an article about him in Life magazine in September of '50 because he got killed in Korea in September of '50. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery. I've been to his grave. Well, anyways, when everybody pulled back, Hurd was still lying here wounded, and Father Francis Sampson was the Catholic chaplain for the 501. And he came up and stayed with Hurd and gave him first aid. And the Germans were up in there for a while, but they didn't take either one of them away. And then they pulled back, and when F Company came back up in here, about an hour later, they counted over 30 Germans that had been killed in this area. Most of them were killed by Stanley Green's machine gun. But I met the French lady who worked with the graves registration people to show them where all the bodies were from both sides. The farmer owned this land, piled up 30 German bodies near the highway here. I have a picture of her, 1994, I think, standing there pointing at the spot where all those bodies were piled up. So that was kind of a confirmation of what Gillis had told me about how many were killed, because she said there was over 30 of them there. So I'm going to give this back to Denise now until she needs me for another battle explanation.
That's just a little picture from the book, kind of summarizing some of what Mark just told us. Now I'm going back to my dad's interview from 2004, some of his memories. Another memory I have is of being on this beach, on the stretcher, waiting for transport to the Army Hospital in England. Incoming GIs were coming in on landing craft. It was now about 6 days after D-Day, and the soldiers were still coming in. They looked at us wounded with quite a bit of attention. They were thinking, this is real now. At this point in the war, the 101st went back to Newberry for some more training, and my dad rejoined him there after he got out of the hospital. In September, the 501st 2nd Battalion was dropped into Holland, of course with a lot of others, to capture and secure bridges and to keep the highway, later known as Hell's Highway, open for the British troops. But unlike Normandy, they dropped in daylight, they landed in their intended drop zones. Also, surprise was complete, and there was little resistance from the German troops. Unfortunately, victory was short-lived. The Germans recovered quickly and formed a strong counter-offensive. In early October, the regiment, along with the 101st, moved north to what was known as the Island, a narrow strip of land between two rivers. They dug foxholes and fought the enemy very close at hand. Jerry clipped me with a bit of shrapnel a couple weeks ago, hit me on the right side and came out under my armpit. It wasn't bad enough to take me from duty, and best of all, I get an oak leaf cluster for my Purple Heart ribbon. If I get wounded 3 more times, I get a free trip to Washington and a date with Mrs. Roosevelt. In November, the 501st was pulled back briefly for some R&R, but it was quickly interrupted by the next battle. On December 14, 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive, which came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Barely beginning to recuperate after Holland, the 101st was hurriedly called by General Eisenhower to defend important crossroads in the Belgian town of Bando. As my dad remembers, dramatically, we were told to get into these trailers. We weren't told why, but we could tell it was urgent, a big rush, rush, rush. So that was our introduction to the Bastogne campaign. Here, it wasn't a parachute drop, but a truck trailer. The drama built up because in Europe, it's crisscrossed with roads that lead to little villages. At these critical junctions, we would never stop. I can feel such emotion now because we didn't know what was happening, but we knew it had to be something important. It was a 200-mile trip to Bastogne. The 501st, along with the rest of the 101st, were quickly encircled by German troops. And now the 501st 2nd Battalion keeps moving east, and Mark is going to tell us a little bit about that battle.
Okay, there was a mistake a couple slides back. The Battle of the Bulge actually started on December 16th, not the 14th. But those of you who are World War II buffs know that. Anyways, when the 101st came up from Camp Wormline, they came up to the west perimeter of Bastogne. They got off the trucks here, actually farther up near Mont Saint Etienne, and some of the troops never even went into Bastogne. The 502 went up here to the northwest perimeter and the north perimeter. The 506 was here between Foy and